Are labor unions good or bad? And what I assure you is, at least temporarily, a completely hypothetical scenario. If I were the emperor of the universe and the right of employees to organize was not yet enshrined in law, I'd sign the legislation in a heartbeat. Self-protection against employer abuse is a fundamental right. I personally have never been a union member, but I've interacted with and worked with various union members. I've always gotten along with unions because I acknowledge their roles and don't overstep my boundaries. But over time you see things and hear stories, which leads us to the premise in the title. To understand labor relations in the United States, we need a bit of context. During the industrial revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States industrialized faster than almost anywhere else in the world. The transition from individual hand labor to use of machines and the consequent rise of mass employment in industries ranging from textiles to railroads to coal mining resulted in seemingly inevitable labor problems. In that era, the legal landscape was far less developed than now, and businesses were far less constrained in all facets of employment, be it worker safety, working hours, or working conditions. The take-it-or-leave-it approach left workers in company-run towns with few other options. Consequently, labor relations in the United States entered a long and often bloody phase. You can judge how bad things were at times by the names of some of the significant events, such as the Ludlow Massacre, the Mattawan Massacre, and the Battle of Blair Mountain. One estimate is that more than 700 people, mostly strikers, have died in strike-related violence over the years. The actual total may be much higher. The early period of labor history is now generations in the past and will never be repeated, but it continues to set the tone for labor relations in certain industries even today. Substantive change came with the arrival of the Great Depression. The resulting national focus on problems for workers everywhere changed expectations regarding employee rights, with subsequent legislative responses. The Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 established a requirement for paying local prevailing wages on public works projects. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 authorized the President to regulate fair industrial wages and consumer prices to stimulate economic recovery. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, also known as the Wagner Act, is foundational United States labor law. It guarantees the right of private sector employees to join unions, engage in collective bargaining, and take collective action such as strikes. And with that, the right of workers to engage in collective action was assured. However, the pendulum apparently began to swing too far in favor of unions. The Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, better known as the Taft-Hartley Act, made major changes to the Wagner Act. Taft-Hartley restricts the activities and power of labor unions. Employees have the right to refrain from participation in union activities, although they can be required to join as a condition of employment. The Act also defined additional unfair union practices. The 1959 Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, otherwise known as the Landrum-Griffin Act, amended Taft-Hartley to further protect union members from unfair practices by their own unions. For instance, the new law established a code of conduct guaranteeing certain rights to union members within their union and imposed reporting requirements. Let's look at the larger picture. Abusive employer practices are often driven by the result of a race to the bottom, driven by competitive forces that mandate cost-cutting to keep pace with rivals. The role of legislation is to set enforceable standards that apply to everyone. This kills the perverse economic incentive toward intolerable or inhumane practices. Many years ago, I had an interesting conversation with a fellow whose career was in the merchant marine. He'd worked aboard freighter ships during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, so he'd more or less seen it all. He described the crew quarters on non-union ships as primitive, uncomfortable, inadequate, and even dangerous. Union ships had proper lighting, adequate bunks and ventilation, and much better food. Suffice to say, he was firmly pro-union, and rightly so. And that brings us to today. Among other degrees, I have a master's in business administration. In business school, labor unions were mentioned. But if you suppose that the curriculum was anti-union, you would be wrong. The provided wisdom was that companies that have unions deserve them, and that the union they get is exactly the one they deserve. Not much was said beyond that, but the message was clear. If you mistreat your employees, expect consequences. At one point, I delivered a talk on the topic of employee intellectual property rights at a conference. A couple of AFL-CIO representatives were in attendance. They liked my ideas and chatted me up afterward. During our conversation, I mentioned the union-free example of IBM. Their spin was that IBM's generous wages and benign working conditions destroyed the solidarity between workers, as if proper treatment was a bad thing. IBM's non-union status is based upon a corporate culture that emphasizes employee identification with the company and close relations between employees and their direct managers. Anonymous feedback is used to address employee grievances quickly. However, this enlightened approach is perhaps possible only because of the educated white-collar nature of the computer industry. Elsewhere, it is often the exception. While researching a paper on a business topic, I came across a publication for workers in the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or HVAC industry. One of the articles was along the lines of 10 ways to get ahead in your job. The points of advice included such seemingly elementary wisdom as showing up every workday, arriving on time, showering regularly, shaving daily, and wearing clean clothes. For my purposes, the article is useful not for the content as such, but for the insight into the target readership. The apparent proletarian character of HVAC industry employees translates directly into an incentive for management to adopt an overbearing paternal style. Unsurprisingly, HVAC workers and related trades have multiple unions. So what is the effect of a unionized workforce? An engineering colleague related this story. A bunch of engineers were working on a very important project, but were awaiting a specialized piece of equipment. When the equipment finally arrived, there was a problem. It came in a wooden crate, therefore only someone from the carpenters' union was allowed to open it. Here's an experience from the vice president of a magnetics factory. Most of their products are small, custom-designed transformers for aerospace applications. The VP went to a large aerospace campus to visit one of their engineers. As they talked in a conference room, he asked the engineer if he would like a free product sample. The answer was yes, whereupon the VP reached into a suit jacket and laid one on the table. Well, you'd think he just pulled out a hand grenade. Only the union was allowed to carry things, you see. He had to go back to the front gate and wait nearly an hour for a union worker to arrive with a pickup truck, place the small transformer into a cardboard box along with paperwork, and then drive it to the loading dock, a distance of all of a couple hundred feet. Now I choose my battles carefully, but I also don't suffer fools gladly. I'd have reclaimed the sample as personal property, and thus beyond the reach of the union. Upon reaching the gate, I have continued to the parking lot and driven away. The sample would have been mailed the next day. But I suppose the VP didn't want a potential black mark on his company reputation. Nevertheless, the insistence on union theater rankles with its pettiness. And then there's the exhibit hall I will never visit again. That would be McCormick Place Convention Center in Chicago, where I once exhibited at a trade show. The show itself was pretty good, but the word from other exhibitors was that you would be wise to let the union handle exhibit setup, because if you set it up yourself, it might get, quote-unquote, accidentally hit by a forklift or otherwise damaged. So I paid, and watched the smirking union guy bill me a minimum 1 hour charge for about 10 minutes of actual work, which he repeated as he went around the hall. It was the second day of the show that convinced me to never return. That's when I discovered that a piece of equipment had disappeared overnight, apparently stolen, while the hall was purportedly locked and guarded. I immediately did two things. One was to visit other exhibitors, which confirmed my suspicion that this had happened all over the show floor, often with very expensive equipment. The second was to confront convention center management. When they played stupid, "Well, you have insurance, right?" I upped the ante by calling the Chicago Police Department of the local newspaper, the Chicago Tribune. The police did show up and take a report. Nothing came of it. The newspaper did not respond. But the management was rattled that I didn't roll over and play dead like I was supposed to. When the show finished on day 4, it was time to pack up. I was busy doing exactly that when the same union guy showed up and announced himself. He looked rather unhappy when I told him I didn't want his help. Fortunate for me, my modest exhibit fit into a pair of containers that I could roll directly to the rental car. There was no chance for mysterious loss or damage in the warehouse area while awaiting freight pickup. Months later, the show contacted me about exhibiting the next year. I was frank about why that was never going to happen, and they seemed pretty sheepish about it. So yeah, to hell with McCormick Place and their corrupt union. They should slide into Lake Michigan and pollute it some more. Unions are often seen as a means for inarticulate workers in commodity jobs to collectively assert power that the workers lack individually. An oft-cited benefit of union membership is the right to involve a union representative in disciplinary actions. Another is ready access to legal advice. Unions generally put a lot of emphasis on seniority. While that can create a steady career path, it does make it harder for ambitious superstars to advance up the hierarchy, and also makes it harder to demote or sack dishonest, incompetent, or underperforming workers. Other drawbacks of labor union membership include less autonomy and the more or less continual presence of workplace tension. Good unions justify themselves as a valuable employer resource by providing worker screening, training, and certification, by acting as a hiring center, and by policing membership to ensure adherence to standards of quality of work. I have a nephew who I'm told loves his good union even more than his job. Bad unions view employers as exploitable resources that require constantly hostile relationships and occasional subversion. Some unions spend member dues on fat cat leadership salaries and luxurious headquarters, treating the membership itself as another exploitable resource. Perhaps ironically, perhaps inevitably, unions sometimes have trouble keeping their own houses clean. The largest union in the USA, the National Education Association, has had bitter contract disputes with its own staff. And the big kahuna of organized labor, the master federation representing 60 individual unions, the AFL-CIO itself, was picketed by its own headquarters employees in October of 2018. They're represented by Office and Professional Employees International Union Local 2, which declared on its website that the AFL-CIO is anti-union. If you fire up your web browser to search for information on this embarrassment, it's obvious that they spent a lot of money attempting to scrub it from the internet. To me, the obviousness of the effort is itself another embarrassment. Well, whatever. The historical record is out there, if you look hard enough. Unions must remain continually vigilant against two external forces. One is the insidious fascination of organized crime with the power and money of organized labor, especially pension funds. Over the years, the Department of Justice has had to work hard to disentangle affected unions. If you don't believe me, ask Jimmy Hoffa. The other is the old false god of Marxism. Marxists have a doctrinal fascination with labor unions. They viewed them as natural places to peddle their excrement. The rhetoric promises a workers' paradise, yet the historical record betrays the actual truth. Marxists bring zero value to unions and are to workers and unions what pedophiles are to your neighborhood. How do we explain the decline in union membership over the years? It's really a symptom that their cause is just and that basically they won. What was formally determined by strikes and other labor action has largely been supplanted by legislation and government enforcement. There are legal consequences for unpaid wages and violation of minimum wage, overtime pay, and child labor laws. Everyone gets these protections without needing a union. With the universal issues taken care of, what is left for unions are things specific to their respective industries that fall outside of the scope of formal law. Beyond the ever-present issue of wages, such matters include the right to disengage outside of work, medical insurance, and vacation pay. These would have been beyond the comprehension of 19th century coal miners, who would have been overjoyed to trade their problems for such things. But there is a new wave of union organizing. Warehouse workers for Amazon, Starbucks baristas, and video game coders for Microsoft are examples. These are commodity positions where workers are considered interchangeable. In that respect, it's reminiscent of the coal mines of yore, but with higher skill levels. Time will tell how that works out for everyone. Here's a recent story about a small chain of coffee houses. This is a competitive business with thin margins, and the wages reflect that reality. Long story short, the employees decided to improve their pay, not by upping productivity or by cost reductions, but by unionizing. What they ignored was that the business had not turned a profit in its 13 years of operation. The next week, after receiving notice of the intent to unionize, the company cited rising costs, falling sales, lease expirations, and the wage demands as reasons for shutting everything down. No business is obliged to run as a charity, and now we can congratulate these workers for getting the big bad company off their backs by killing it so they have no work at all. And thus the new generation of unionizing workers must learn the classic lessons of Economics 101 all over again. In summary, asking whether labor unions are good or bad is to ask the wrong question. Some arguably fall into one bucket or the other, but most inhabit the gradations in between. They're as individual as their industries and histories, which mirrors employers themselves. It is up to individual unions whether they serve as useful partners in the engines of commerce or as a terrible cure for terrible problems. It is up to individual employers to accept the partnership or not, or better yet, simply be enlightened and humane. Please comment, like, and subscribe. I'd like to hear your stories. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.